Hello, everyone, and welcome to Exploring the Neponset River, this month's special virtual tour by the Friends of the Boston Harborwalk. My name is Alice Brown, and I'm the Chief of Planning and Policy at Boston Harbor Now and the Boston Harbor Now liaison to this incredible group of volunteers. If you're not familiar with the Friends of the Boston Harborwalk, they do great work in three major areas. They do tours, usually on foot, but now online in COVID times. They also do cleanups around the harbor, and they're doing a few of those still today, but not many. And if you're very interested, please definitely reach out to their fearless leader, Mike Manning. And then the third thing they do is incredible research on signage. So you'll start to see around Boston lots of places where people have started putting up this really incredible interpretive signage with photography and historical information. If you want to learn more about the Friends in general, you can go to bostonharbornow.org/friends. And if you want to learn more specifically about the signage and some of the background of the signage and Spanish interpretations of the signage, you can find all of that at boshw.org. With that, I am going to let you know that you're on Zoom tonight. Because we're on a Zoom webinar, you are all invisible. Lori and I can see your names, but that's all, so don't worry about any secrets being shared. If you have questions for us, you can use the chat button, which is on the lower center part of your screen, or the Q&A button. The Q&A button is generally better for asking questions. We'll go through those at the end. We'll be able to clear things out or do live answers to them. So I recommend using the Q&A. The chat is good if suddenly you can't hear one of us, the Wi-Fi goes out, you have a technical question, use the chat for that. And tonight, we're going to start in just a few minutes with a poll. So that's very exciting. The final option is that you can raise your hand if you want to, but I think for tonight, the Q&A and the chat functions should be what you're looking for, and they'll be located right in the middle of your screen. If you're watching on an iPad or an iPhone or any other handheld movable device, you can tap the middle of the screen and those options will pop up either right there in front of you or with a little ... in the corner. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my friend Lori Zapalak to tell you all about the Neponset River.
Great. Welcome and thank you for joining us this evening. A bit of background about me. I'm the principal of Zapalak Advisors, an urban planning practice that focuses on real estate and economic development. And many of my projects are about guiding the transformation of historic industrial landscapes and historic maritime cities. So places like the Neponset River and the Lower Mills are near and dear to my heart. So tonight we're going to start with a poll question, and that is, and everyone hopefully can see the poll, what's your favorite way to explore and enjoy the Neponset River? So we'll let you all pick answers to that poll. And some of these we'll probably discuss in a few minutes, and we'll give it just a few more seconds. We see a few more votes coming in, 12 of 20. Great, 13, don't think too hard. Great. Okay, we'll give it, let's see, 5 more seconds, and then Alice, do you want to end the poll? Great. Okay, the poll is now closed, and it looks like walking or running is the winner, followed by biking, followed by picnicking. So hopefully by the end of this, I will encourage you to also want to do some kayaking and some birding, some photography, and some other things. Great, and let me just move the poll out of the way, alrighty. The Neponset River is sometimes called the Forgotten River, and compared to the Charles, it looms much less large in the psyche of most Bostonians. Speaking personally, for me, it's one of those places where the more I spend time experiencing it and learning about its ecology and history, the more intriguing it gets and the more questions I have. I hope it becomes that kind of place for you, or at the least, I hope that you found some place or many places along the Boston Harbor and our wonderful waterfront that make you feel connected to nature, to others, and to your own imagination. Our discussion tonight will not be strictly chronological, but I want you to consider a question. Why have important events taken place along this river, some critical firsts in American history, time and time again, and particularly in the Lower Falls area, or Lower Mills as it's known today, this lower reach of the river? And what might this suggest about the future of the river? Make sure we can advance. Tonight we're going to talk about we're kind of going to look at 5 key themes: the geographic characteristics that shape the river, what we know about Native American occupation of the watershed prior to colonial settlement, the unique factors that made this river a critical colonial resource and tied, in fact, to the birthplace of American independence, how the river supported early industrialization and innovation, including an early center of chocolate making in North America, or the early center, and what happens when rivers are deindustrialized, how communities shape and are shaped by efforts towards ecological regeneration and recreation, in fact. At the end of this talk, because sustenance is both motivating and important, I will also share recommendations from my favorite places for great coffee, ice cream, and delicious meals as part of your visit to the Neponset, along with links to a couple of great maps to guide your visit and some suggestions about how you can become more involved in the stewardship of the river. So, geography. Let's begin with the broad geography of the river and its watershed. The Neponset forms Boston's southern border with Quincy and Milton. The river originates in Foxborough and snakes, and this is really the top here where you see the reservoir, and snakes through the landscape in a northerly direction for 29 miles to reach Dorchester Bay. The watershed itself, this outlined area here, is 115 square miles. So what's important about that is that is the area that collects not only water as it flows downhill, keeping in mind that the Blue Hills is this area kind of to the south of the river, but also trash and pollutants all eventually often make their way into this river system. And this river has, as you just saw, many branches and tributaries. These are usually streams or brooks originating at ponds, many of which provided enough headwater and flow to be the sites of 17th, 18th, and 19th century development. So in communities like Foxborough, Walpole, Norwood, Westwood, Sharon, Stoughton, Kenton, and Hyde Park. Today there are still more than 100 dams of various types along this river. There are also canoe and kayak launches at various points along the river, as this map indicates with the red dots. You can see them here in the various tributaries. But do bear in mind that canoeing is not continuous because of dams, but you can use those launch points to explore the river. Let's just move here. Most of the talk tonight is going to focus on really the lower reaches of the river. This is the Lower Mills area here on the screen, with the estuary below it reaching Dorchester Bay. And today, the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation, that's DCR, owns much of the shoreline of what is now known as the Neponset River Reservation in this area. And a number of organizations led by the Neponset River Watershed Association and the Neponset River Greenway Council in particular have been involved for decades in the creation of the Neponset Trail, much of which follows the former path of the Dorchester and Milton Railroad. As of 2018, that trail from the Lower Mills all the way to Tinian Beach, just up here beyond Commercial Point, was 8.2 miles, and from 2018 to the present, that trail system has been extended north to the area of Central Square and Mattapan, and there's a new fabulous bridge, which I will talk about and show you a little bit later in the talk. There are still many more segments of the trail system left to be created. And importantly, we're talking about the Neponset River, and we are the friends of the Boston Harborwalk. So you can think of these two trail systems as overlapping or coming together. Technically, the Boston Harborwalk is designated as reaching the tidal reach, which is essentially where the tide comes up the river, which is about to the Neponset Gorge, just south of the Lower Mills area. What's exciting about that is that, essentially from the Neponset, you can travel connecting to the Boston Harborwalk all the way up the 47 miles of the Harborwalk. So that's pretty cool, with a few critical gaps, but that it can be done. Whoops, let me see. Let us just focus here for a moment and advance real quick. So as I mentioned, most of this talk is going to focus on the lower reaches, but because what happens upstream affects what happens downstream, it is important to mention a few certain events and landmarks. And one in particular that I want to point out, so this is our river, here you can see, and then it actually flows south towards Foxborough. But here, I've also indicated the location of, let me start up here, of the Charles River. So what's really interesting about the Charles is that it really snakes around a whole lot. So it actually comes south and continues to zig and to zag. And I want to point out here, this section that's called Mother Brook, because that was actually the location of the first industrial canal built by European settlers in North America and in Dedham. And essentially what that did is it connected the Charles River into Mother Brook to capture more water flow so that a mill could be built in this area. And that happened very early on. So that's one of the interesting early industrial innovations that took place on this river. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm going to come back to that. But just so you have some orientation, this is the area that we'll focus on a lot, but the towns of Milton and Quincy to the south, and then the neighborhoods of Dorchester and Mattapan and Hyde Park, and then Dedham, which is both north and south of the Charles as it curves around. Also, I want to point out Thompson Island. That plays a role in our story of this river as well. Pretty interesting one. Talking about pre-colonial occupation of the watershed and what we know, archaeological investigation has identified at least 9 sites along the river from which it is surmised that the watershed has supported habitation or occupation by Native Americans. That goes back approximately 10,000 years. So this is an area that has a long history. And if you think about it, the richness of that, in fact, is due to this rich heritage, is due to the fact that because of the presence of the estuary of the river. So the estuary of the Neponset has been known, and even is today, is valuable as a resource, particularly for seasonal fish harvest. The fish population, including anadromous species, so you have alewife, blueback herring, American shad, rainbow smelt, and these are species that are born in fresh water, that then live in the ocean, that then return to the river and swim or try to swim upstream to spawn. So archaeological evidence shows us that Native Americans would catch fish in weirs, essentially fish traps set up adjacent to the locations of where the natural falls exist in this river. And if you think about this as a seasonal activity, to me it's pretty interesting because You think about what else might happen in kind of seasonal occupation of the landscape, so that there would be other seasonal rituals, community rituals that would happen when tribes would come in to take advantage of this harvest. So it's not unlike the seasonal, in some ways, you know, the seasonal things that we do today. This weekend I went apple picking, for instance. So it's, you know, just thinking about the way that we're tied to our natural resources in New England, to me, is pretty interesting, and the different ways that that goes back over time. So what, in terms of who these people were, we know that the Massachusetts tribes, Algonquin-speaking people, call the river Neponset. That's the origin of the name, which in fact does mean harvest. And that the river was then formally named by Dorchester settlers. So that's where the origin of the term Neponset comes from. And the lower falls and narrow crossing point was known as Unquity, or Unquity-Quisset, which means where the headwaters in the Neponset meets the tidewaters of the bay. And that is, in fact, as I mentioned, what is a tidal reach, that point of tidal reach, which is how far the tide can come up the river. And that is, to a degree, variable. The Neponset Gorge, as well as the falls, kind of keep the tide back. But usually what happens in areas like this, they're ecotones, they're regions of transition between two biological communities, in this case, freshwater and saltwater, and usually they're teeming with life. So as was the case and still is the case today at the beautiful area of Milton Landing. If you've been to the site, you've probably seen just how robust it is, but it's really quite remarkable. So what we know, and this is something I'm curious to learn more about, is that the lower reaches of the river in this area here was some of the last land retained by Kutchamakan, who is a Sachem of the Massachusetts tribe, based in the Neponset area and the Blue Hills area, before he deeded much of that land to the Dorchester, the land comprising Dorchester and Milton, to colonists. So that's very interesting to think about as a transaction that took place. And by 1616, so there is evidence, of course, that Europeans were exploring the New England coastline for a while, but by 1616, Captain John Smith has mapped this coastline on a fishing expedition, literally, and we get this map, or the world gets this map, and I find it intriguing for a couple of reasons, and in particular related to the area that we're talking about tonight, because of the fact that what is known of this map is that the actual description of the coastline is remarkably accurate if you compare it to a modern day map. Of course, you'll see that only some of the rivers are identified with any degree of detail. And in this case, the Charles is, whereas the Neponset is not. But what we do get in the area of the Neponset is this indicator of Choyat Hills, which is the largest hill in this area on the map, which we can presume is the Great Blue Hill, or Blue Hills. I also want to point out that there are names of settlements on this map of 1616 that obviously predate, for instance, the settlement of Plymouth in 1620. So it's important to keep in mind that while the coastline is fairly accurate, the town names are quite aspirational on the part of Captain John Smith, but clearly they had some influence. So moving along to the idea of the idea, well, and actually let me back up for a moment. At about the same time that Captain John Smith is mapping this land there is a massive spread of disease by European fishermen coming into the area. So there's a great loss of Native American population at that time, known by 1618. 1620, Plymouth is founded. 1630, Dorchester is founded just a couple of months before Boston. And what else is going on in this area that is known to have occurred is that in 1619 or 1626, Englishman David Thompson establishes a fur trading post on what today is called Thompson Island, and that there is some record of Native Americans bringing skins down the river to the island for sale. And then sometime before 1633, there's evidence that it is known that Richard Collicott built a small wharf on what is Gulliver's Creek, which is just here. We'll look at that in just a moment, to carry furs towards Thompson's Island for sale. So, and just move here. So if we, actually, I'm going to back up because I like this image for this. That in addition to the abundant wildlife of the river, the lower falls area, so this area here, it was critical to early colonial settlement for at least three. It's narrow enough to be the closest inland crossing point. So if you think of between Boston and Plymouth historically, so it strategically links the Massachusetts Bay Colony with the Plymouth Colony. The gorge and topography create a pinch and gravity enough for hydropower. And then this estuary is, at the time, was navigable. And so, and it was protected. So you have this protected area that is suitable for shipping and shipbuilding, which emerged as European settlement came into this area over time. So you had colonists developing shipping and shipbuilding sites at Milton Landing, just here, the Forbes Wharf, Gulliver's Creek, and all of these had direct access to Dorchester Bay. And then in 1634, so pretty soon after those early, the settlement was occurring both within Dorchester and Boston. In 1634, what this wonky document tells us, and it's an unfinished tracing. It was made in 1661, but there's a really important note scribbled or recorded in the corner of this document, which I'm going to show you in some detail here. And so what that tells us is that it says, note number 1, this year Ye Plantation granted Mr. Israel Stoughton liberty to build a mill upon Neponset River, November 3rd, AD 1633. It's ordered that he should have the privilege of a weir adjoining to his mill. And then it says, note number 2, in 1638, Brady Wilkins has liberty by the court to set up a house and keep a ferry over the Neponset, to have a penny, and to have a penny person to be directed by Mr. Stoughton, Mr. Glover. So essentially what we get is one of the first kind of mixed use developments in the Boston area, where we have a mill, we have a penny ferry, and there eventually would also be a fish market. So this early, and it makes perfect sense when you think about it. The crossing, it's tight, one thing supports the other, and the development really kind of begins in this river. Actually, let me back up here. So development starts, and a couple of things are also important. You know, Boston was of course growing at this time, but the Miltontown Landing, if you think about it in relationship to Boston, it could service towns farther south. In addition to the fact that some of shipping was, you know, at this point even international, but this the shipping area was known to be cheaper than Boston, so it was competitive in that way. And, you know, it's just today as we have many sources of wharves and waterfronts. And so what's also interesting to me is that if you go down to Milton Landing, just south of the bridge on the Milton side, today you get this incredible view down the river, across where the estuary begins, and it really can feel this sense of kind of that, you know, 18th century early colonial settlement spirit of place, I think. It's also an interesting site to visit because the Milton Yacht Club is there, and there are still some pretty interesting things taking place. Restoration of a handmade boat. There's a shipyard railway that's been in use for a very long time, and it's just a really pleasant place to explore. But in addition to this grist mill, which really begins the milling and manufacturing activity on the river, I mentioned so that shortly after that time, it was in 1639 that the construction of the canal on Mother Brook was begun. And so you have that also taking place from 1639 to 1641. And then in 1665, a gunpowder mill was constructed on the Milton side. A second mill is constructed because that mill eventually blows up, and the second mill is constructed on the other side of the river. I'm going to come back to that because it's a really important aspect of the history of this area. But some other firsts that took place along this river in 1710, the first iron silting mill, 1728, the first paper mill at the Ware Mill site, which is where Crane learned his paper-making craft of Crane paper and the paper made for US currency. Some other paper milling innovation took place. And then in 1765 was when the first major commercial chocolate factory in the US began, right here at the lower mills. And then one final known innovation, or at least, sorry, more than one, the first railroad was constructed along the Neponset to transport granite from Quincy for the construction of the Bunker Hill Monument, and also in 1817 the first power veneer sawmill. So in short, there have been all these innovations kind of layered one over the top of the other, leveraging, I think, probably past innovation in industry. And to me, it's a really intriguing aspect of this river in terms of what it's supported over time. But pausing just a moment to talk more about the powder mill. So this is important because of the role that the mill played in just really helping decide the King Philip's War, which took place from 1765 to 1675. I think I just have my dates wrong. To 16. I'm going to pause on that. 1668. I think I may be off by 10 years. Anyway, we'll look that up. That's why we have Wikipedia. But so as you all may recall in history, around this time, 1665, there we go, to 1668, I think. In relationship to the Plymouth colony and to Massachusetts Bay Colony, the leader of the Wampanoag tribe that first interacted with these colonists, Massasoit, had a relatively peaceful relationship in organizing between the local tribes and the arriving colonists that existed for about 50 years. Upon his death, his two children assumed leadership and things did not go as well. His younger son, Metacomet, who's also took an English name known as King Philip, never achieved the same level of trust. And this fallout leads to one of the most brutal periods of war within what is today the United States. And so what happened is that colonists needed to defend against Indians and the French, the English colonists. They didn't want to rely upon the crown for fear of violating their charter. Plus, it was difficult and dangerous to transport gunpowder, which would be necessary to defend themselves over long distances. So they couldn't ask the crown for gunpowder, nor could they get it if they were to be provided it. So it's kind of like, if we lose our charter, we part with all right of self-government. And so what transpired is that selectmen of every town organized to produce a supply of gunpowder. They would be fined if they did not, but the issue was that not all places had an ample supply of raw material to produce gunpowder. So in 1673, I got my dates wrong, sorry, I'm gonna move past that. There's record of a land purchase, and where essentially investors in Boston bought part of the land adjacent to the Lower Mills area, and there was a deed to build a power mill in 1674. And from that, we know that the powder mill along the Neponset was critical. It was what is believed to have been the first powder mill constructed for these colonists. And to put it in perspective, the population of New England had about 80,000 people across 110 towns, of which 64 were in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. By 1676, the population of Indians is estimated to be about 10,000, because by that point, so many had died because of disease. So King Philip's War, 1675 to 76, is a period of great violence and essentially ransacking of towns. Native Americans really desiring to push the colonists out as colonists continued to move west into New England. And eventually, obviously, the colonists won out. And this proved to be the deadliest war per capita in American history. 3,000 Native Americans killed, 1,000 colonists killed, 12 colonial towns completely destroyed, economies of Plymouth and Rhode Island colonies in shatters. But what it did that is important from a standpoint of mindset is that really solidified this idea of independence from the crown. We will protect ourselves. And this idea of beginning to develop an American identity free from reliance upon the crown. So that idea literally has a foundation on this river, and I think it's pretty interesting. But when you ask why this river, it gets even more interesting. And that is because this river had access to a ready supply of saltpeter. And saltpeter was harvested and manufactured for gunpowder and then eventually for fertilizer as well. And saltpeter is composed of potassium nitrate, which you'll see historically referenced as white snow or white gold. And it could be made from guano, literally from bird poop, high in nitrogen, phosphate, and potassium. So think about Thompson's Island. Think about the other islands of the harbor, and think about that massive estuary. And so this river provided that thoroughfare for accessing and mining guano. And it proved to be really important. So it's a really good example of a natural resource being critical to a political event. And let's keep going. And so if we look at how the area of the lower mills transformed over time, it's really interesting because you can still see some of the evidence of this growth over time today. So this is Adams Street. This is the bridge over the lower mills. And I just want to show you, this was the location of that first powder mill. So I encourage you to kind of walk along that area and just think about that. And then the second powder mill was here, and you'll see these other mills, grist mill, fulling mill, paper mill, by 1765. By 1826, you see a robust record of development that continued along this critical juncture or path. And then what is interesting is that if we look at just briefly, some of y'all may be familiar with this map because of the fact that it's a pretty well-known Revolutionary War map printed in London. It portrays the Battle of Lexington and Concord, which had occurred a few months earlier. But what I find intriguing is the way that Mother Brook is depicted as being huge, which is really not that big. And then this is the Neponset River, which gets called the Milton River on this English map here below. And we see the Blue Hills here. And then this, which is the rest of the primary branch of the Neponset actually coming south. So, you know, even this map, Thompson's Island, shows us really interesting things about the way that this river has been thought about over time by different people for different purposes. Oops, and I forgot we were going to zoom in like that, but look, we did. So then moving on kind of in history to think about how this industrialization continued to evolve. I mentioned that in 1826, the first commercial railroad began moving granite from Quincy. And that it took the granite to Gulliver's Landing, which is at the mouth of Gulliver's Creek, just below the Neponset. And this map of Dorchester and Milton from 1831 also is really, you know, this is a map produced by the towns of Dorchester and Milton. And to me, it's intriguing because it's really all about, or so much about, the town as a center of industry. So zooming in to look and focus at the Lower Mills area, we see all of these various mills, kind of major monuments and businesses depicted, the Neponset House, the hotel. We see the depiction of this estuary environment below the Neponset Gorge. And if we continue, and then we also see the railway. So here we start to see this interaction between the role of the railroad and shipping by waterway. And to think about how these two things would come together and then how eventually they would actually have a conflict is pretty interesting along this river. So just moving ahead really quickly, this map also tells us that the river was appropriate for, or could support, vessels that drew between 10 and 11 feet of water to the head of the tidewater. So again, kind of showing us these really interesting aspects of how this river could serve industry. And then in 1854, there was an interesting plan to actually consider dredging the river. This map is oriented differently. It's kind of north is really up here, but and you start to see the crossings, the bridges, the railroad now crossing the river. So this question of, would this river serve railroad? Would it serve shipping, or could it serve both? And for a while, it did serve both, but eventually the railroad and of course the automobile would win out. And if we look at, by 1876, we go back to looking at the river at the scale of the watershed, we see this just copious numbers of cotton, woolen, and mills and salt and grist mills that are on each of these various tributaries of the river. And so this watershed was very much an industrialized watershed early on. And by 1890, this is what Hyde Park looks like. And you see these illustrations of these massive mill complexes with their smokestacks. If we zoom in, we can look. So here is the Neponset River, and Mother Brook is located just here. So this is where the Charles then would come into the Neponset. And over time, the the neighborhood of Mattapan itself, this is Mattapan Square, would have, between Hyde Park and Lower Mills would also support incredible industry. We see the railroads coming in, very developed centers of economic and social activity early on. And this great map, which I'm going to share a link to at the end of the presentation, shows you some of these highlights of not only the Baker Chocolate Factory, which we'll talk about, but also the first water-powered mill, the railroad. It's really incredible just how much is present here. And so we, of course, have to talk for a few minutes about chocolate. So the chocolate history is really is quite fascinating in the respect that it evolved over time, and it started very early though. In 1765, the first chocolate production began as a collaboration between John Hannon and Dr. James Baker. The Baker family, 3 generations of bakers would evolve the chocolate business. And then after 3 generations, there was no distinct heir. The heirs of the 3rd generation were living in Europe, didn't want to come back, I guess. And Henry Pierce, a step-nephew, stepped in to operate and lease the factory. And it was really Pierce that brought the Baker Chocolate Factory to the prominence that we know that it became. And what was interesting is that in the time that the bakers were developing their chocolate production, there were other competitors, chocolate producers, Preston Ware, Webb and Trombley, that were locating in and around this area. And over time, Pierce acquired them all. And he did something really interesting. So this is Henry Mill Pierce. He did a couple of things that are very interesting. One is that as he built new mills, he named them for these various chocolate companies. So you'll see reference to those names on the mills that exist today. And then he was a master of branding. So the trademarked image of La Belle Chocolatier helped to bring the Baker chocolate to the masses. And even though chocolate production here, started and then grew over time, and production, grew into these massive buildings that were eventually built. It wasn't just the volume of the product that's so interesting to me about what was created, but also the innovation with this idea of the brand and the identity and what chocolate was. And I think the best analogy I can think of is that Baker chocolate, the brand is a little bit like Starbucks. It brought chocolate into popular culture. It really permeated it, everything from baking chocolate to, and instead of becoming something just for elite, but from baking chocolate to cocoa. Cocoa was actually a huge part of the business. It was a drinking breakfast chocolate. And then from there, innovative practices in terms of the number of women who worked in these factories, just so many things. It's a really rich history, and I recommend the book on the Baker Chocolate Factory that Anthony Sinmarker has written for a deeper dive into this history. But so this is what the complex looks like today, and as I mentioned, just this incredible innovation. And I love this about this idea of this advertising about Baker's cocoa is particularly adapted for elderly people as it contains considerable fatty matter, more than 1/4, yet is easily digested and is pure and delicious. So just remember that, everyone, that chocolate is nutritious. And this is the complex at about 1920. So again, it's a really interesting history. We don't have time to go too far into tonight, but I recommend you dig a little deeper. Now, what happened is that the Baker Chocolate Factory continued until 1965 in the Lower Mills area. After Pierce died in 1896, it was acquired by the Forbes Syndicate. And then in 1927, Forbes sells it to Postum Cereals, which then becomes General Foods. And the operation in 1964-65 is moved to Delaware and then to New York. In 1995, Kraft acquired General Foods, and Baker Chocolate continues as a product today. So I bet some of you will have continued to buy it and to use it. Over time, it grew to 5-acre site, 7 mills, or the 5-acre site that was acquired grew into 7 mills over 14 acres, so really massive. But so what happens when industry, like the Baker Chocolate Mill and many others that were up in the upper reaches, or the upper area of the river, leave? We know that there was a massive amount of disinvestment that occurred from the mid 20th century up into the 70s and 80s in Dorchester and Mattapan and Hyde Park. And what's interesting to me to consider is that at the same time, this river still, it was a place of industry for hundreds of years. It also at that same time continued to be a place of recreation and enjoyment. So these various and sometimes competing interests being overlapped on one another. And I love this image as a reminder of that. This is from, I believe, 1965. And, showing these men out at their fishing shack, fishing sometimes with 2 fishing poles in at once. It's one form of connection to the river. Even as the river itself changed and the river was polluted and the river was degraded, but river in some ways also remained enigmatic. And so after the closing of the factory in 1965, this is the interior of the powerhouse building. And then what was interesting that took place is this revitalization strategy that was about not just restoring buildings, but really kind of creating this urban village concept. And so the idea of that, really thinking about how to revitalize this whole neighborhood. And that's what the dark areas represent, kind of coming up along Dorchester Avenue, and thinking systematically about what would take place, what could replace the Baker business. And so a long process of complex historic rehabilitation has taken place to convert these buildings primarily to market rate housing. What's interesting about that is that there was affordable housing, public housing put into the neighborhood in the middle of the 20th century, but there was really a need for market rate housing. And so the architectural team, the architects led a fabulous project. This entire complex is now listed on the National Register of Historic Places. You can see in this upper image before the restoration of the powerhouse, and then the lower image. And in part, this architecture, these buildings, these complexes were built by 2 architects. So it's very cohesive in nature. The firm Bradley, Winslow, and Weatherall did the majority of the buildings, with the exception really of the administration building built in 1924. And we've seen these buildings an evolution of power generation, which is also interesting. One of the most important things was the ability to refrigerate the chocolate so that production could take place all year round. And then this is what the interior of the powerhouse building looks like post rehabilitation. So pretty fabulous. I'd like to live there. And then what also happened when this complex was listed on the National Register, at first it was listed without including the worker housing that surrounds the complex, and subsequently that was added to the National Register nomination. I think that's really important in telling the broader story of not just of the company itself, but the workers and the neighborhood that supported it. Then the other really critical theme that that in the notion of kind of rehabilitation and regeneration is that the Neponset River has been experiencing an incredible process of ecological restoration and recommitment towards recreational uses. So a master plan was developed. This is part of the phase 2 work that shows you creation of parks and paths and bridges. And over time, DCR has been leading this effort. And this is just a quick timeline of the many amazing things that have had to happen to get the river to where it is today, beginning with acquisition of salt marshes before in the 1890s. So those marshes below the lower mills, which became public land. And then most recently in 2018, the creation of the Harvest River pedestrian bridge just near between Mattapan Square and Central Avenue. And then this map too shows us that the trail system also extends on the Quincy side of the Riverwalk, going all the way out to Squantum Point. So you can't circulate along the river's edge like entirely consistently, but you can really cover a lot of it, and it's pretty phenomenal. Let me just continue, and this is the Harvest River Bridge. And then just to bring us to a close, I was curious to see how people who put things on Instagram kind of depict this river. And these are some of the images that, that appear if you go to #LowerMills. And then finally, so how can you get more involved? I highly recommend you download the Neponset River Greenway map, which I showed. And there's also a paddler's guide. And then while you're out exploring, Sweet Life has incredible sweets, the Ice Cream Smith, also on Dorchester Avenue. And then if you need a great meal on the Milton side, check out Steel and Rye. But that lower block of Dorchester Avenue where the urban village concept was envisioned really has become that, or that idea has been restored. And there's a number of phenomenal restaurants. And then to get more involved, there is a fall cleanup next Saturday from 9 to 11. You need to register for that. And the Neponset River Watershed Association, the phenomenal leadership organization stewarding the river, has started their Watershed Wednesdays virtual lunchtime speaker series, and the next one is October 21st. So check that out. It'll be about saving our native trout. And with that, Alice, I'm gonna turn it back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lori. That was fantastic. I learned a ton. Loved all the connections to the Native American populations and King Philip's War and chocolate. Like, who knew that this place that is forgotten by so many people has such a fascinating history? Looking at who is here, though, I know that we have some South Dorchester and Milton residents on the webinar tonight, so I'm sure they were more aware of it. And we've got our first question in from Ellen. She asks if you could know anything about the possibility of removing the dam at Lower Mills.
So I think that I would recommend engaging the Neponset River Watershed Association. What is interesting is that the Superfund application that's underway now, in part, has surfaced originally because of concern for fish migrating and then the water quality itself. So I don't exactly know, but I can tell you who to go to on that.
Fantastic. And I'll also note, Ellen, that the dam, the first part of the dam is low enough relative to ocean levels that this past week at high tide each day for about 4 days in a row, you couldn't even see the dam because it was totally flooded, or like the first parts of the falls. So it may be an impact from sea level rise that it becomes obsolete. But I am certainly not the expert. It was just something when I took people to see the dam, and I was like, this first little falls part is gone this week. We've got a question from Stephen. How is it that Neponset became a place for chocolate processing?
Yeah, so it seems to have to do with this relationship between Hannon and Baker. Baker was a doctor. Baker was an investor. He had a store, and Hannon was let's call him an entrepreneur as well. And they got together. Hannon actually was the go-to who was traveling to the chocolate producing areas. Also important to remember that cacao production was originated in terms of what service the Baker factory originally would have been on plantations. It would have been from slave labor. So it's important to think, I didn't mention that, but it's important to think about that. And even chocolate today is often produced in places where, unfortunately, the pay is not always great. But go read the history of chocolate if you want to find out more about that. But it really seems to have been a product of that relationship and thinking about the tie of the New England economy to the Caribbean, for instance. But we also know, I should point out, chocolate was produced, or a version of chocolate, by the Aztecs. So there is a precedent on North American, in the Americas. It was the conquistadors who brought Mexican chocolate to Europe, and then Europe really began its love of chocolate, and then that was then brought back to New England. So in terms of knowledge of the product, but Pierce was going to Europe to look at how Dutch and German chocolate was being made, and he was actually, one of his key innovations was to buy German equipment to process the chocolate in the factories here.
And it looks like we're like running down on the time, but Andrew asks maybe a last question. Why did the issue of defense and gunpowder threaten the colony's charter?
Yeah, because they were either going to, they couldn't ask essentially the king for protection, because they were supposed to be semi-autonomous, essentially, or they were supposed to be independent, really, to a large degree, per the contract of the charter, or the charter itself. And so it was either ask for help, or if they then if they were not able to defend themselves, obviously they would be made obsolete. So it was between those two things that they had to prove out their self-reliance and their ability to defend themselves. And then clearly that begat increased independence and autonomy from the king.
Great, thank you. We've got a few extra thanks and hellos in the chat from Brian, from Mike, and from Andrew. There are multiple Mike Mannings on, but I think the original one had a final question about the Baker Chocolate Building, asked if there was a fire or a flood that impacted it.
There was at least one fire, and there were apparently many keg parties. So Mike Manning, I don't know if you were one of those people who at some point, but there's a pretty interesting conversation also on Instagram about things that used to happen in those buildings before they were then restored into, to fairly nice housing. So that's probably the unwritten chapter of the Baker Chocolate Factory that I have a feeling a few people could contribute to.
Great. I love that you have these excellent suggestions up here. For those of you who didn't get them down, you can definitely get involved in the Neponset River in a variety of ways. There are friends groups, there's a major friends group as well as a nonprofit, and then there's also, you can get involved with the Friends of the Boston Harborwalk, who Lori is a part of. So again, that's bostonharbornow.org/friends. We hope that you can join us on future virtual tours and hopefully real life tours after the COVID times are over. I'm going to give Lori a huge round of applause. I know that you are all out there doing the same.
Thanks for your patience, everybody. That was my first go at talking to an imaginary audience.
They're here. I'm sure they appreciate it. And with that, we'll wish you a great night. Thank you so much.
Thank you.